What do we really inherit from the past? Wisdom or warning? Most of history reaches us in fragments. A shard of bronze, a line from an old chronicle, a burial mound open to the light after centuries of silence. We picture the ancient world as distant and dim, a place of stone walls, hand-forged blades, and slow-moving armies. Yet buried inside that familiar image is another truth. Long before factories, laboratories, and modern battlefields, people were already testing the boundaries of what war could become. They learned to hide danger inside the smallest wound. They learned to turn flame into an instrument, smoke into a weapon, and simple tools into machines of astonishing precision. Again and again across continents and centuries, human beings discovered that survival often rewarded invention faster than conscience could restrain it. The result was not only a history of combat, but a history of moral unease. Because these weapons were never just objects, they were questions made real. How much suffering is acceptable in the name of victory? At what point does ingenuity stop being admirable and become something harder to name? And why do societies, even in the midst of fear and conflict, keep returning to the same instinctive conclusion that some methods of killing feel different, darker, more difficult to justify? This story begins there in that uneasy space between necessity and restraint, not with modern treaties or industrial warfare, but with older landscapes, grasslands under a cold skate, harbor waters lit by fire, fortress walls swallowed by smoke. In each place, someone believed they had found a decisive advantage, and in each place, others were left to reckon with what that advantage meant. To follow these forgotten weapons is not simply to study violence. It is to look at humanity under pressure, to see what we create when fear sharpens the mind, and to ask whether knowledge itself is ever innocent once it has learned how to wound. The past does not only preserve what people built, it preserves what they were willing to become. What if the deadliest weapon in the ancient world was almost invisible? Imagine a narrow arrowhead resting in an open palm. It looks unremarkable at first glance, no larger than a finger, shaped for speed and silence. But on the cold grasslands where mounted archers ruled the horizon, the danger was not only in the iron point, it was in what clung to it, a trace of poison, a wound too small to fear at first, and far too late to escape once its work had begun. Among the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, warfare demanded mobility, distance, and psychological force. Riders moved like weather across immense open land, appearing quickly and vanishing just as fast. Their bows were already feared for range and precision, but some accounts suggest that certain warriors deepened that fear by treating their arrows with toxic compounds drawn from decay, venom, and plant-based toxins. Whether every detail in those descriptions is fully recoverable now is less important than the pattern they reveal. Ancient fighters understood that the body could be defeated not only by impact, but by contamination. The effect was more than physical. Poison altered the meaning of injury itself. A cut was no longer just a cut. A scratch could become a sentence. For the wounded, uncertainty was part of the torment. For the enemy, the knowledge that any arrow might carry something unseen created a second battlefield in the mind. There is something especially haunting about a weapon that keeps fighting after it has already landed. It turns time into an accomplice. Pain arrives in phases. Fear spreads through rumor, through memory, through the sight of one soldier collapsing long after the skirmish appears to be over. And so this early marriage of chemistry and warfare reminds us that human conflict has never depended only on force. It has also depended on imagination, on the capacity to look at nature and ask how its hidden properties might be bent toward survival. But when knowledge enters a wound, where exactly does ingenuity end and cruelty begin? Can a fire remember the hand that released it? At dusk, the sea can look almost merciful. The surface softens, the horizon blurs, oars dip quietly into black water, and the distance between one ship and another feels manageable, almost intimate. Then a car arcs through the air, breaks against timber, and suddenly the night is burning in a way sailors have never seen before. Not a simple flame, something thicker, hungrier, a fire that clings. Across the ancient Mediterranean, incendiary warfare took many forms, from burning pitch to oil-soaked projectiles and mixtures designed to spread panic as much as damage. Long before chemistry became a modern science, military minds understood that heat, resin, sulfur, and oil could be combined into something far more terrifying than an ordinary blaze. On wooden ships and crowded decks, where escape was limited and water was sometimes useless against the wrong kind of flame, fire became more than a weapon. It became a kind of living disorder. Its power lay partly in spectacle. A blade kills one body at a time. Fire seems to erase boundaries. It moves along ropes, crawls over planks, leaps from sailcloth to skin. It fills the air with sound and confusion. Men are not only wounded, they are disoriented, stripped of control, forced to witness destruction that feels almost elemental. In those moments, battle ceases to look like strategy and begins to resemble catastrophe. And yet the people who designed these devices were not inventing chaos for its own sake. They were answering practical fears: how to stop an approaching fleet, how to defend a harbor, how to turn limited resources into decisive force. Necessity, once again, sharpened invention. But necessity has always had a talent for disguising the emotional cost of what it creates. There is a reason fire has never been only a tool in human memory. It warms, illuminates, protects. It also devours without hesitation. When people learned to weaponize it with intention and craft, they crossed into a moral landscape that still feels familiar now. Because the question has never been whether humans can command destructive power. The deeper question is why that power so often begins by borrowing the language of nature itself. What happens when the ground beneath a city becomes part of the battle? Picture a fortress at first light. Its walls appear solid, almost eternal, rising from the earth as if stone itself had chosen to stand upright. From the towers, defenders watch the fields beyond the gates and count the enemy fires in the distance. What they cannot easily see is the quieter threat below them. Men in darkness, digging through packed soil, carrying the siege not toward the wall but under it. Ancient warfare was often a contest of patience. Armies could wait for weeks or months outside a stronghold, testing food supplies, morale, and weather as much as weapons. In that long tension, tunneling became one of the most unsettling forms of assault. Miners carved narrow passages beneath foundations, sometimes shoring them up with timber until the right moment, then burning the supports or packing the chamber with combustible materials. When the structure above gave way, a wall that had seemed immovable could suddenly split or collapse into its own dust. There is something profoundly disorienting about this strategy. Most defenses are built to face outward. Arrows, towers, gates, and battlements all assume the danger will arrive in visible form. Tunneling violated that assumption. It turned architecture into uncertainty. It suggested that safety is never only about what surrounds us, but also about what we fail to imagine beneath us. For the defenders, the fear was psychological as much as structural. Every faint vibration, every strange sound in the night could become a warning. Countermines were dug, ears were pressed to the ground. War moved into a hidden world of darkness and listening, where victory depended not on spectacle, but on whose silence broke first. And maybe that is why siege tunnels still resonate beyond their time. They remind us that human conflict is rarely limited to the visible arena. Again and again, people learn to work around strength instead of confronting it directly. We do this in war, in politics, even in private life. The wall is never only a wall. It is also a test of whether we can recognize the forces gathering where we are least prepared to look. How do you defend yourself against a weapon that falls from the sky before you ever hear it coming? Stand on an ancient battlefield and look upward for a moment. Not at the banners or the smoke, but at the empty air above the front lines. For long stretches, nothing happens. Then suddenly the sky seems to harden. Stones descend in violent arcs. Darts whistle downward. Heavy shafts plunge with terrifying the speed, and the open ground between armies becomes a place where gravity itself has been recruited to kill. Among the most formidable engines of the ancient world were the machines built to magnify force through tension, torsion, and patient geometry. Ballistae, giant bows mounted on frames, could send bolts through shields and armor with chilling precision. Catapults and related engines hurled stones not only to break walls, but to scatter formations and unsettle entire ranks. These were not crude tools of brute power. They were disciplined machines, requiring calculation, skilled crews, and a deep understanding of materials under strain. What made them so unsettling was their impersonality. In close combat, a person sees the face of danger. With artillery, death arrives abstractly, launched from a distance by hands you may never glimpse. It comes from beyond the ordinary reach of the body, beyond the familiar scale of human strength. That distance changes the emotional texture of battle. It makes violence feel mechanical, almost administrative, as if destruction has been placed on a schedule and fed through a device. And yet these engines were also monuments to intellect. They reveal a civilization learning how mathematics could be turned into momentum, how wood, rope, sinew, and metal could be arranged to imitate forces much larger than any one soldier. Their existence blurs a boundary we often imagine as modern, the line between craftsmanship and systems thinking, between artisan labor and technological warfare. Perhaps that is the deeper unease they leave behind. The machine does not invent aggression, but it can refine it. It can make distance feel efficient, precise, even rational. And once a society discovers that intelligence can amplify destruction so elegantly, it must confront a difficult truth. Progress does not always move toward mercy. Sometimes it simply teaches us how to strike from farther away. What if the most dangerous weapon was not the blade itself, but the silence that followed it? In the close air of ancient combat, battle was intimate in a way modern distance sometimes obscures. Men heard one another breathe. They saw hesitation in an enemy's shoulders, fear in the eyes just above a shield rim, exhaustion in the trembling grip around a spear. And in that world of immediate contact, some weapons were designed not only to wound, but to remain inside the wound, to complicate healing, to make survival a slower and more uncertain ordeal. Barbed points, hooked blades, and jagged spearheads appear across different cultures and eras, shaped by a brutal understanding of the body. These were instruments made with knowledge of resistance, how flesh tears, how armor catches, how panic rises when extraction becomes its own injury. A clean strike ends one kind of struggle. A weapon that snags or fractures within the body begins another. It forces the wounded person and those trying to help into a second battle after the clash has already moved on. There is a particular cruelty in that design. It extends violence beyond the moment of impact. A healer must choose whether to pull, cut, or leave the object where it lies. Comrades must decide whether to stop and carry the injured or keep moving and risk losing them. The weapon continues to shape events even after it has left the attacker's hand. Its power lives in delay and complication, in the knowledge that pain can be engineered to linger. And still, the people who made such weapons were often not monsters in the way later memory may prefer to imagine. They were participants in harsh worlds, solving immediate problems with the logic available to them. How do you stop a cavalry charge? How do you make one strike count when supplies are scarce and numbers uncertain? War narrows morality into harsh arithmetic, and necessity can make almost any design appear reasonable from the side that fears extinction. That may be the most unsettling lesson. Violence is rarely created by evil alone. More often, it emerges from ordinary minds, adapting too well to extraordinary pressure. And when survival becomes the measure of invention, who decides which forms of suffering are merely tactical, and which ones leave a stain that outlives the battle itself? What if sound itself could become a weapon? Before armies collided, there was often a moment of suspension. Wind crossing an open plain, dust lifting from the march. A silence so thin it seemed ready to tear. Then came the noise. Horns, drums, shouted commands, the metallic pulse of armor in motion. Ancient warfare was always physical, but it was also deeply theatrical, shaped by the understanding that fear could travel faster than steel. Some of the most potent tools on the battlefield were not built to cut or burn, but to overwhelm the senses. War trumpets, massive drums, shrieking projectiles, and even specialized formations of voices could unsettle opponents before the first decisive blow was struck. The goal was not simply communication, it was emotional disruption. A sudden blast in fog or darkness could suggest greater numbers, stronger confidence, or a force closer than expected. Sound collapsed distance. It made uncertainty feel immediate. In siege warfare and open battle alike, armies learned that terror could be amplified through rhythm and repetition. A synchronized roar from thousands of soldiers, the pounding cadence of drums against fortress walls, The strange whistling of launched missiles cutting through the air. These were experiences that entered the body before the mind had time to interpret them. The heartbeat answered first. Breath shortened, order wavered. Once that happened, even well-trained fighters could begin to imagine defeat before it had actually arrived. This was not illusion in the simple sense. It was strategy rooted in a profound reading of human vulnerability. People do not encounter danger only through what they see. They feel it through vibration, echo, dissonance, the sudden breaking of expected calm. Ancient commanders understood this with remarkable instinct. They knew morale could fracture long before a line physically broke. That insight feels surprisingly modern. We still live inside systems that use noise, repetition, and emotional saturation to shape behavior. The battlefield changes, but the nervous system remains ancient. Perhaps that is why these sonic weapons still echo across time. They remind us that human beings are never defended by armor alone. We are also governed by perception, and perception can be shaken by something as invisible and as intimate as sound. What if a weapon's true power was not in how many lives it took, but in how completely it changed the rules of distance? There was a time when battle depended on proximity. To harm another person, you had to close the space between you and accept the danger of being seen, heard, and struck back. Then came devices that altered that ancient bargain. In the hands of skilled archers and engineers, the crossbow emerged as something quietly revolutionary, compact, forceful, and unnervingly efficient. Its design was simple in appearance, almost modest. A bow fixed horizontally to a stock, a mechanism to hold tension, a trigger to release stored energy in a single controlled motion. But that simplicity concealed a profound shift. Unlike the long training required to master a traditional bow, a crossbow could deliver formidable power with less physical strain and in some cases less time to learn. It allowed strength to be stored in the machine rather than in the body. The weapon remembered the effort for you. That mattered on crowded walls, in defensive positions, and intense encounters where a single shot could decide the outcome before swords ever met. A bolt launched from a crossbow traveled with enough force to threaten armor, enough precision to make distance feel suddenly unsafe. For the person facing it, the experience must have carried a special dread. Here was a weapon that seemed to compress human intention into one small decisive act. No flourish, no warning, just release. And with that came anxiety, even in the societies that used it. Across history, certain weapons provoke discomfort not only because they kill, but because they redistribute power. They make old skills less dominant. They unsettle accepted hierarchies of courage and status. If a machine can grant lethal reach to someone with less training, what becomes of the older ideals built around mastery, honor, and visible risk? The crossbow asks a question that echoes far beyond its age. When technology makes force easier to deliver, do we become more secure or merely more willing to trust mechanisms with choices once carried in muscle and nerve? Every age builds tools that promise control. Every age must also live with the quieter truth that control, once mechanized, rarely stays simple for long. What if the battlefield could be poisoned without a single blade being drawn? A well is an act of trust. So is a granary, a cistern, a storehouse of dried grain waiting through winter. Civilizations are built not only on walls and roads, but on the quiet systems that keep bodies alive when the season turns hard. That is why some of the most unsettling tactics in ancient warfare were aimed not at soldiers directly, but at the fragile sources of endurance hidden behind the front lines. Long before modern ideas of chemical warfare, armies understood that food and water could be turned against the people who depended on them. Wells might be fouled with carrion or waste. Crops could be burned just before harvest. Supply routes were cut, orchards destroyed, reservoirs contaminated or seized. These acts required no dramatic duel, no visible contest of champions. Their violence unfolded slowly, through thirst, hunger, disease, and the gradual collapse of strength. What makes this form of warfare so haunting is its patience. A sword strike is immediate. A poisoned or ruined supply works in silence, day after day, moving through households, through children and elders, through those who never stood on the wall with a weapon in hand. It dissolves the familiar line between combatant and civilian. The target is not simply an army, but a community's ability to remain a community. And yet, to those who ordered such tactics, the logic was often brutally practical. Why storm a defended city at great cost if deprivation could do the work more efficiently? Why meet strength head-on when survival itself could be turned into leverage? War has always tempted people towards solutions that seem rational from a distance and unbearable up close. That tension remains difficult to escape. To attack an enemy's sustenance is to admit that victory may depend less on courage than on attrition, less on confrontation than on eroding the conditions of life. It reveals something unsettling about human ingenuity, that we are capable of studying dependence itself and finding ways to weaponize it. And once we understand how vulnerable a society is to its lifelines, can we ever again look at those lifelines as simple, innocent things? What if the most feared weapon was the one that turned the body's own limits against itself? In the dust and heat of ancient war, survival often depended on endurance. A soldier could train for impact, brace against fear, even prepare for the sight of blood. But some weapons were designed to exhaust the body before they ever destroyed it. Their purpose was not only to kill, it was to trap, to slow, to overwhelm the muscles and breath that made resistance possible. Consider the weighted net, the entangling chain, the hooked implement meant to catch shield, ankle, or wrist. In arenas, on skirmish lines, and in specialized forms of combat, such tools transformed movement into vulnerability. The stronger the struggle, the tighter the trap could feel. A person who had prepared for a blow suddenly faced something more disorienting: the loss of freedom itself. Balance vanished. Timing failed. Skill became useless in an instant if the body could no longer move in the way it had been trained to move. There is a special psychological force in that kind of weapon. A blade threatens pain. A trap threatens helplessness. It exposes a truth warriors have always known but rarely wished to name. That much of combat depends on rhythm, coordination, and the fragile illusion of control. Once those are interrupted, even briefly, the mind can collapse into panic. To be immobilized before a watching enemy is not only dangerous, it is humiliating. These devices also reveal a different form of intelligence in ancient warfare. Not every invention aimed for greater penetration or larger scale. Some aimed for interruption. They studied the human body as a system of leverage, motion, and weakness. They asked how victory might come not from striking harder, but from making resistance impossible. That logic reaches far beyond war. Human beings have always sought power by restricting the movement of others, physically, socially, psychologically. Perhaps that is why these weapons still feel unsettling. They remind us that domination is often less about destruction than about control. And when control becomes the highest goal, the line between defeating a person and unmaking their dignity can grow very thin indeed. What if the cruelest inventions were the ones that made the air itself feel unsafe? Smoke has always carried mixed meanings in human life. It can signal warmth, cooking, ritual, a household gathered through the night. But in war, that familiar veil could be turned into something else entirely. Imagine defenders inside a narrow passage, a tunnel, a gatehouse, or a chamber beneath a wall. At first, there is only a strange odor, then a thickening cloud, then the sudden realization that breath itself has become uncertain. Ancient armies and engineers learned, through experiment and desperation, that enclosed spaces could be conquered without direct contact. Fires fed with sulfur, pitch, damp straw, or other choking materials could drive people from tunnels and fortifications. Smoke could blind, confuse, and weaken. In underground warfare especially, where air moved poorly and escape routes were few, it became a terrifying equalizer. A confined space that once promised protection could transform into a trap. What makes this tactic so disturbing is its intimacy. It does not always rely on visible wounds. Instead, it enters the body with every involuntary breath. The victim participates in their own injury simply by trying to stay alive. That paradox gives suffocating weapons a special moral weight. They turn the most basic act of survival into the channel of harm. And still, from the perspective of those who use them, such methods were often brutally strategic. Why sacrifice soldiers in a blind tunnel fight if smoke could clear the space first? Why let defenders hold a narrow advantage when the environment itself could be altered? Ancient warfare repeatedly returned to this logic. If the terrain can be changed, it can be weaponized. Stone, fire, water, darkness, and air all become part of the same grim vocabulary. Perhaps that is why these tactics linger in memory more as unease than spectacle. They remind us that danger is not always a visible enemy advancing toward us. Sometimes it is the world around us, subtly changed by human intention. And once people discover that even the air can be shaped into an instrument of force, what remains untouched by the imagination of war? What if the most enduring weapon was not made of iron or fire, but of fear carried from one generation to the next? By the time certain weapons entered legend, their physical form had already begun to fade. The blade rusted, the bow split, the siege engine collapsed into nameless timber. But the memory remained. People told stories about what these inventions had done, how they altered battles, how they seemed to exceed the accepted terms of conflict. In that way, some ancient weapons achieved a second life more powerful than their first. They became symbols of human excess, ingenuity, and unease. History often preserves violence this way, not as a complete record, but as an afterimage. A poison arrow becomes a cautionary tale about unseen harm. A fire weapon becomes shorthand for destruction that cannot be easily contained. A machine that strikes from afar enters memory as proof that distance does not soften cruelty, only changes its shape. Over time, the details blur, but the emotional truth survives. People remember not just what a weapon did, but what it made them feel about the kind of beings we are. That emotional residue matters. It tells us that warfare has never been only a technical contest. Every invention enters a moral atmosphere. Communities judge, fear, admire, or condemn, not just based on effectiveness, but on whether a method seems to violate some deeper expectation about proportion, courage, or the limits of necessity. Even in brutal times, people still drew lines in the mind. They still sensed that some forms of violence leave a different kind of mark. And perhaps those old reactions are worth taking seriously. They suggest that conscience is not a modern invention layered onto an anciently savage world. It has always been there, flickering beside invention, asking difficult questions no matter the century. What are we normalizing? What part of ourselves are we training into habit? What survives in memory after the victory song fades? The artifacts may be broken now, scattered in museums, texts, and fragments of rumor. But the deeper story remains unbroken. Every age inherits not only old tools but old dilemmas, and every generation must decide whether knowledge will merely increase its power or deepen its understanding of what power costs. What if the true story of ancient weapons is not about how they changed history, but about how they changed the people who imagined them? By now, the pattern is difficult to ignore. Again and again, across deserts, coastlines, fortresses, and open plains, human beings looked at the world around them and saw more than landscape. They saw possibility. Poison in roots and venom, fire in oil and resin, collapse hidden in timber and soil, power stored in bent wood, twisted cord, sharpened metal, and carefully measured force. The same intelligence that built homes, studied stars, and crossed oceans also learned how to wound with greater precision. That is the paradox at the center of this journey. Innovation does not arrive with a moral direction attached to it. It is born from curiosity, pressure, necessity, fear, and ambition all at once. A weapon may begin as an answer to a vulnerability, a way for the outnumbered to endure, or the besieged to survive. But once created, it rarely remains only defensive. It enters memory. It travels. It invites imitation. What was once a desperate solution becomes part of the expanding grammar of conflict. And yet the most revealing consequence may not lie in the damage itself. It lies in what these inventions force societies to confront about their own values. Every new method of harm raised questions older than any empire. Is efficiency the same as wisdom? Does distance reduce guilt or only hide it? Can a civilization call itself advanced if its creativity outruns its compassion? These are not ancient questions alone. They belong to anyone living in a world where knowledge moves faster than reflection. Perhaps that is why forgotten weapons still matter. Not because they are relics of cruelty set safely behind us, but because they expose a recurring human temptation to admire what is possible before asking what it does to the soul of a culture. The past is full of devices that promised advantage. Some delivered it, but all of them left behind another inheritance, quieter and harder to measure. The burden of deciding whether mastery over nature also requires mastery over ourselves. And if history offers any wisdom here, it may be this. The danger was never only in the weapon. It was in the moment a society began to mistake capability for permission. In the end, the oldest weapons tell us less about ancient battlefields than about the enduring architecture of human choice. Across this journey, we have moved through poisoned wounds, clinging fire, hidden tunnels, machines of tension and stone, the tyranny of noise, the precision of the crossbow, the slow violence of tainted water, the humiliation of entrapment, the terror of smoke, and the long shadow of memory itself. Each invention emerged from a specific place and pressure. A city needed defending, an army needed an advantage, a community feared annihilation. No weapon appears in a vacuum. Behind every device was a human problem, and behind every solution was a human cost. That may be the hardest truth to accept. History is not divided neatly between the inventive and the cruel, the civilized and the savage. Very often they are the same people at different moments, or even in the same moment. The hand that studies nature for healing can also study it for harm. The mind that learns to calculate distance, pressure, and chemistry can build bridges or devise new forms of ruin. In that sense, ancient warfare is not a foreign country. It is a mirror held at a longer distance. And yet this story does not end in despair. To remember these weapons carefully is also to remember that people, even in violent times, sensed the moral weight of what they were doing. They argued, hesitated, drew lines, crossed them, regretted them, and told stories afterward that carried warning as much as pride. Conscience survived alongside ambition. Uneasily, imperfectly, but persistently. Maybe that is what the past still offers us now. Not a catalog of horrors, and not a romance of lost power, but a deeper humility about what knowledge can become in frightened hands. Every generation inherits tools, but also thresholds. Every age must decide which possibilities it will treat as progress and which ones it will leave untouched. So the final question is not whether these ancient weapons could have changed history. They did. The deeper question is whether history can still change us, enough to make us wiser before invention races ahead again, and enough to remind us that memory, at its best, is not only a record of what humanity has done, but a guide to what it still hopes to become.